Welcome to today's teaching. Thank you so much for watching. And this time I'm going to be looking at Let's Talk About Hitler, finally. And I'm going to be teaching this probably just in one long teaching, which Renee will split in the middle. So when you see the same clothes, don't get confused, because it's just me keeping going so that we get two teachings into this. And I do encourage you to listen to Greg Laurie, the little video I posted last week, because it's just five minutes or so, and I think you'll be blessed by it. So now today let's talk about Hitler. And I've got so much information in my head that I could probably talk on this all day, but thankfully I'm not going to do that. And so we're going to just consider a few things scripturally first of all. But I'd like to read the passage of scripture I've been using while we've been talking about things pertaining to the Antichrist. And that is in 1 John 4. And I'm going to be reading it in the New Living Translation. No, I won't. I'll read it in the NIV because I've got that to hand. So he said this, and I'm going to read 6 verses, but really the one I want to focus on is verse 6. And he says, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." This is how you can recognize the Spirit of God, and this is so important. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And that is why we know instantly that Islam actually embodies the spirit of Antichrist, because they do not believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. In fact, their statement of faith declares that their God has no son. And John makes this very clear. He says, every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of Antichrist, which you've heard is coming and even now is in the world. He said, "You, dear children, are from of God, and you've overcome them, because the one who's in you is greater than the one who's in the world. They are from the world, and therefore speak from the viewpoint of the world, and the world listens to them." Now here's verse 6, and this really is the one that I'm going to be focusing on today. He said, "We are from God, and whoever knows God listens to us, but whoever is not from God does not listen to us. This is how we recognize the spirit of truth and the spirit of falsehood." And John says, and as you look through history, you find that there are many individuals who embodied the spirit of Antichrist. In the world today, we have an entire religion, which is the religion of Islam, and that embodies the spirit of Antichrist. But definitely, it gives us the picture of a world leader who actually opposes everything that is Christian and everything that is Jewish. There's something in them that absolutely hates the Jewish people. And I spoke to you the last time I spoke on Haman, who was the villain in the book of Esther, who wasn't content with killing one Jew, Mordecai, who refused to bow to him. But he got into this kind of an absolute frenzy of rage, where he wanted to wipe out the entire race from which Mordecai was birthed. That is an unnatural. It is something that is so beyond a natural response. It's overkill. And then we see the same thing embodied in Herod. And when I was listening to my own teaching just to see what I'd covered, and I realized that I said that Herod sent his soldiers out to kill every baby born in Bethlehem and the villages, but of course I meant every baby boy. Sometimes you skip out a word or you say something wrongly, not by intention, but you just do. And so I want to correct that there. But Herod, when he was warned, King Herod, when he was warned by the wise men that one who was born to be king of the Jews had been born, was in such a frenzy that he'd asked the wise men to come back and to tell him where this child was. And he said, "I want to go and worship him." But he actually wanted to do the opposite. He wanted to go and kill him, to actually remove this threat, his threat to his kingship. And so when the wise men were warned in a dream not to go and tell him, they left by another way. And when Herod realized that the wise men hadn't come back, he asked where was he to be born, and they said Bethlehem. So he sent his soldiers out to kill all the baby boys in that area who were 2 or younger, because he didn't know the exact time Jesus had been born. And I also just want to say again that Jesus wasn't a baby in arms anymore, because by this time Mary was in the house with the child. She wasn't in the cave or the whatever place it was that she was where he was born. But it might have been a stable, but as I've read and studied, it seems more likely to be a cave where animals came in to be housed, and when the weather was bad, and that was when they were fed. And so he was housed, and he was born in this stable or in this cave, and then he was laid in a manger, which was a feeding trough. They put him there instead of a crib because there was nowhere else for them to put him. So they probably, on top of the straw, put down a blanket or something like that, and the baby was put on top of that. But by the time Herod was looking to kill, Jesus was already out the country in Egypt. And when he came back, his parents went to live in Nazareth. But Herod wanted to kill off. He just went on a killing spree out of anger, out of an absolute fury that the wise men hadn't told him where this child was born or where the child was living. Now, those were biblical figures. But as you go through history, you found that there were many, many antichrists who were identified at the time, and in each century you found that there was somebody that historians tell you was believed to be the Antichrist, and they will even give you some things that were written by the people who identified them. But none of them was the beast, the one that we're looking toward, which actually speaks of the end times. And we are the only people in all of history who can actually believe that we're going to live to see the beast. We're going to live in an age, and the only reason for this is that all the signs spoken of in the book of Revelation, John's revelation of Jesus Christ, please don't say revelations, it's one revelation given to John by Jesus to show him. In verse 4 you read, he says, come up and see what is going to happen. And so from chapter 4 of the book of Revelation, one revelation to one man, when he was taken up to heaven, it was opened and he saw all these things, and he described them in symbolic language. So it's very, very difficult for anybody to lay out a timeline. But I've spoken about that so many times, I won't go there again. Because then I will really be hammering, like Martin Luther nailed his thesis of 94 points to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. I would be like nailing it 95 times into your head, so I won't go there. But we're going to look at the Antichrist who was identified in the 20th century. And I think of all the previous Antichrists who were identified, Hitler is the one who came absolutely sort of exactly what the Bible said would happen, except for a few things. He didn't come back to life for a start. But we also know that the Antichrist could not return until a few things were set in place. I've mentioned it before, I'm going to remind you. The Antichrist could not appear until there was a nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel was only formed in 1948. And the reason we know this is because in Zechariah, who's also prophesying about the end times, in Zechariah, it talks about when you see the armies. I'll just go there and read it to you quickly. But you'll see that there has to be a nation of Israel, and it has to be something where Jerusalem is the sort of the major city. And so he says in chapter 12 of Zechariah, he says, "This is the word of the Lord concerning Israel. The Lord who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundation of the earth, and who forms the spirit of man within him, declares, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem." And he says this in verse 3, "On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves." And if you read Zechariah 12, 13, 14, but particularly chapter 12 and chapter 14, there's a lot more about what is going to happen on that great and terrible day. And so there has for an Antichrist to be the beast, like the Antichrist, who becomes like a tyrannical world leader, we have to recognize that Israel had to be in existence. Now, I also want to say this, give away my punchline right up front. And that is that the atrocities that Hitler committed during the Second World War, which we're going to talk about, those atrocities actually horrified the world to the place that for the first time since Israel went into exile in 586 BC, for the very first time, the world's compassions were turned toward the Jews. And that was because of the millions and millions who had died in the Second World War. They saw pictures, photographs that were taken by the American soldiers when they came to liberate the countries, and they came to actually take possession of Germany and in Austria and the countries in which all the concentration camps were located. And when these photographs came out of people looking like skeletons with skin stretched over them, and the stories of what happened in the Holocaust began to come through to the world, it's the first time ever that there was like a worldwide, or at least a Western world, there was compassion towards the Jewish people. And they were prepared to let them have a homeland. I mean, there were still arguments about it, and a lot of the Middle Eastern countries were opposing it, and the Islamic nations were opposing it. But nevertheless, Israel became a nation on the 14th of May 1948, and the Second World War had ended in 1945. That was the year in which Hitler died. He committed suicide. And incidentally, the woman that he'd lived with, his mistress, for many years, he'd married in the bunker that they were hiding out in, and he married her just hours before they died. And she actually had Jewish roots, so whether he knew, he can't have known that. But it's just amazing that Eva Braun was the woman who, he was in many ways, he was a monster. But he showed some love and tenderness toward her, although other historians will tell you that the only person he really loved was his mother. But anyhow, she had Jewish roots. But he died by his own hand. He shot her, and she knew she was going to be shot, and then he shot himself. And he instructed some of his leaders to take his body and burn it, so that it couldn't be paraded in the streets like Mussolini, his ally in Italy. Because when Mussolini died, the people hung him from a lamppost, and they just, they mocked him, they scorned him. I don't even remember the rest of what they did to him. But Hitler didn't want that to happen to himself, so he ordered that the bunker be filled with fuel and set alight, so that they couldn't even have any of his remains. And to this day, there are these conspiracy theories and stories going around that he escaped from the bunker and he's alive somewhere in South America. At least he'd be dead by now. But up until recently, that he was living in South America. But he didn't. He died by his own hands, and his and Eva Braun's bodies were burned. And so it was only as a result of the stories that came out between 1945 and 1948 that all the preparations were made. And when you go through the Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, it's just terrible as you go through it to see the history of Christian persecution of the Jews. And one of the things that distressed me the most was that even when the war had ended, some Jews had gone, and just while the war was on as well, how some Jews had gone out in ships, and they were begging nations, just begging them to take them in, for the ship to land, so that they could escape the gas chambers. And the countries, not one country would receive them, not one. And they died for lack of food and water out on those ships. And so even at the end of the war, there was a reluctance to take them into safe nations. And there was nowhere for them to go. And many Jewish people were escaping from places where they had been held, or from the concentration camps, and they were just getting to Israel, which wasn't a nation yet. But there were plans afoot to make it a nation. And so they were coming in from the four corners of the earth, literally, which again is what Isaiah prophesied about. And so when Hitler had finished with them and had killed 2/3 of the population of the European Jews, there was a remnant. There was only 1/3 of them left. And so there had to be somewhere for them to go. And that was why the governments were prepared to recognize Israel as a nation. And so it was passed at midnight by the United Nations, with America proposing it, and by a whole series of events, Russia even approved it. And so with Russia and America agreeing together on a vote so that Israel could become a nation, you have to see the hand of God in that. And so all of this came out of what Hitler had done to destroy them. Something actually came. Something good came out of it. And there was an awareness of how they had suffered. But now, all these years later, 70-something years later, you find that people in the UK in particular, they are Holocaust deniers. And they've said that it was all a hoax. No Jew ever died in a gas chamber. It was all just this Jewish hoax so that people would give them a homeland to live in. And in the history books, they are demanding that everything about the Second World War and the Holocaust be removed from those textbooks. But you know what? That's why when they went in and saw exactly what Hitler had done, one of the American generals said, I want a historical record of this. He said, because never again must this happen. And he said, if we've got the proof, if we've taken the photographs and we've got the proof, nobody can deny it. But even against all the odds, just as some people deny that man ever walked on the moon, there are those who deny that the Holocaust ever happened, but Hitler did that. And so I think I'm going to pause here. So God bless you for this week.